The wind in the New Mexico territory had a way of stealing things. It stole the moisture from the earth, leaving behind a jigsaw of cracked, sun-baked clay where good pasture used to be. It stole the hope from the faces of men, leaving them hollow-eyed and brittle as tumbleweeds. In the year of our Lord 1874, that wind felt like it was trying to steal the very breath from your lungs, carrying with it not the promise of rain, but the fine, gritty dust of failure. The town of Redemption was a testament to that failure. It was a place clinging to the edge of a vast, unforgiving plain. Its clapboard buildings bleached gray by the relentless sun. Their signs faded to mere whispers of the businesses they once advertised. The blacksmith's hammer fell with a tired, infrequent clang. The saloon was quieter these days, the laughter inside thin and sharp, edged with the desperation of men who had nothing left to wager but their own dwindling pride. 2 years of drought had crippled the ranches and farms, and the silver bust up north had finished the job, choking the life out of the town until it was little more than a sun-bleached skeleton. In a small, dark house at the dusty edge of town lived Clara Mae Thompson. At 19, she moved with a quiet grace that seemed out of place in such a coarse world. She was soft-spoken, her voice rarely rising above a gentle murmur, her eyes the color of a hazy summer sky. Obedience had been stitched into the very fabric of her being, first by a loving mother and then by a cold, resentful stepfather. Her days were a silent routine of mending, cooking, and cleaning, of trying to make herself small and unobtrusive in the cramped space she shared with Silas Blackwood. Silas had married her mother when Clara was a girl, bringing with him a thin smile and a pocketful of promises that turned to dust as quickly as the land. When fever took her mother 5 years ago, it took the last of the light from the house and the last of the kindness from Silas. He became a man consumed by bitterness, his grief curdling into a quiet rage that he nursed with cheap whiskey and cards. The gambling started small, a way to pass the long, empty evenings. But as his losses mounted, it became a sickness, a desperate clawing to win back a life he felt had been stolen from him. The debt grew like a cancer, and its shadow fell heaviest on Clara. All she had left of her mother was a small, silver locket, worn smooth against her skin, and the memory of her words, whispered like prayers before sleep. Kindness is not weakness, Clara Mae, and dignity is something no one can take from you. You must hold on to it, even when you have nothing else. Clara clung to those words as she clung to the locket, a secret well of strength in the parched landscape of her life. The day it all ended began like any other. The sun beat down, the wind moaned, and Silas sat at the rickety table, staring into a cup of lukewarm coffee. His eyes were bloodshot, his face a mask of grim resolve. He did not look at her when he spoke, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "A man is coming for you today." Clara paused, a dish rag in her hand. "A man?" "Ralph Barlow. He owns the Double B Ranch out north. A wealthy man." Silas finally lifted his gaze, and there was something in it that made a cold knot of fear tighten in Clara's stomach. It was the look of a man who had sold his last calf at market. "He has agreed to settle my debts." The dish rag slipped from her fingers, falling to the floor with a soft thud. She understood. Not all at once, but in sickening waves of realization. The whispers she had heard in town about Mr. Barlow, a hard man, a cruel man, whose first 2 wives had died young and under circumstances people only spoke of in hushed tones. "Settle your debts?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you mean?" "He requires a wife," Silas said, turning his attention back to his coffee cup as if the matter were settled. "He is a cattle baron. He can give you a life I cannot. You will have fine things." "But I do not know him," she pleaded, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Stepfather, please." "It is done," he snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "You will be ready when he arrives, and you will be respectful. My future depends on it." Clara stood frozen, the floorboards cold beneath her worn shoes. She was a debt, a commodity. The teachings of her mother about dignity felt like a cruel joke. How could she hold on to dignity when she was being sold like a piece of a livestock? Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give Silas the satisfaction. She simply nodded, a gesture of submission that felt like a betrayal of her very soul, and went to her small room to pack the few belongings she owned. She placed her mother's locket inside her dress, the cool metal a small, secret comfort against her frantic heartbeat. Ralph Barlow arrived an hour later. He was a man in his mid-40s, thick-set and imposing, with a weathered face and eyes as cold and gray as river stones. He did not smile. He looked at Clara not as a man looks at his future bride, but as he might inspect a horse, his gaze lingering on her form in a way that made her skin crawl. He handed Silas a pouch of coins that clinked with a sound of finality. There were no pleasantries, no words of comfort for her. He simply gestured toward his wagon. "Let's go." Clara looked at her stepfather one last time, a silent plea in her eyes. He would not meet her gaze. He just nodded toward the door, his face a mask of stone. The house she had lived in her whole life suddenly felt like a place she had never known. As she stepped out into the blinding sunlight, she knew she was utterly alone. The journey to the Double B was a long, silent ordeal. The landscape stretched on, an endless expanse of brown and ochre under a vast, empty sky. Barlow did not speak to her, his attention fixed on the road ahead, the reins held tight in his thick-fingered hands. The silence was heavier than any words, filled with a sense of dread that grew with every turn of the wagon wheels. His ranch was not a home, it was a fortress. It sat in a shallow valley, the main house large and imposing, surrounded by barns, corrals, and miles of barbed wire that glinted in the sun like rows of sharp teeth. Men worked in the distance, their faces hard and unsmiling. They glanced at the wagon, at her, their eyes lingering for a moment before they turned away, their expressions unreadable. There was no welcome, no warmth, only silence and the vast, oppressive emptiness of the land. The wedding, if one could call it that, was a mockery. There was no priest, no friends, not even a neighbor to bear witness. It took place in the dusty main room of the ranch house, a space that smelled of leather, stale cigar smoke, and loneliness. A traveling magistrate, a nervous little man with sweat beading on his upper lip, read from a document. It was a contract, not a ceremony. It spoke of duties and obligations, all of them hers. Clara signed her name where he pointed, her hand shaking so badly she could barely form the letters. Barlow signed his with a bold, proprietary stroke. The magistrate pocketed his fee and scurried away as if fleeing a plague. And then she was Mrs. Barlow. The name felt like a brand on her soul. Life on the ranch was a new kind of prison. The house was large and well-furnished, but it was cold and silent. She was given a room upstairs with a large bed and a window that looked out over the endless plains. But the door had a sturdy lock, and she soon learned it was meant to keep her in, not others out. Ralph treated her as he treated his horses and his cattle, as property. He provided food, clothing, and shelter. In return, he expected total submission. There was no affection, no conversation, no tenderness. He spoke to her only to give orders or to comment on her appearance, his words as cold and sharp as the winter wind. She spent her days in suffocating solitude, the silence broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the gruff shouts of the ranch hands. She was not allowed to leave the house without his permission, which was never granted. The barbed wire that encircled the property became a symbol of her own entrapment. The first time he came to her room at night, she froze. He smelled of whiskey and entitlement. He approached her not with the gentle hand of a husband, but with the rough grip of an owner claiming his due. When his hands fumbled with the buttons of her nightgown, a primal fear seized her, and she recoiled, pushing his hands away. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Please." His face darkened, the coldness in his eyes turning to stone. He did not shout. He did not argue. He simply drew back his hand and struck her across the face. The blow was stunning in its force and its cold precision. Pain exploded in her cheek, and she stumbled backward, falling against the bed, tears of shock and pain blurring her vision. He stood over her, his voice a low, menacing rumble. "You are my wife. You will do as I say. You will be here when I want you, and you will accept what I give you. If you ever deny me again, or if you ever think of running, I will do more than leave a mark on your face. I will break you. Do you understand?" She could only nod, her body trembling uncontrollably. A sob caught in her throat. He watched her for a long moment, then turned and left the room, locking the door from the outside. The sound of the key turning in the lock was the sound of her last hope dying. She lay there for hours, the pain in her face a dull throb compared to the sharp, searing agony in her soul. She was trapped. She was his. For weeks, she lived in a fog of fear, moving through the silent house like a ghost. She did what was asked of her, her obedience born now not of a gentle nature, but of stark terror. She submitted to his nightly visits, her body rigid, her mind retreating to a faraway place where she could not feel his touch. But with every passing day, a spark of her mother's teachings, a desperate ember of defiance, began to glow in the darkness. Dignity is something no one can take from you. The thought of escape became a secret obsession, a seed of hope planted in the barren soil of her despair. She watched the ranch hands, noting their routines. She watched the sky, waiting for a night dark enough to hide her. She knew the risks. The land was vast and dangerous, and if he caught her, his promise to break her would be fulfilled. But the certainty of a slow death of the soul in that house was more terrifying than any danger the wilderness might hold. Her chance came on a moonless night in late summer. A storm had been brewing for days, the air thick and heavy with unspoken violence. As dusk fell, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the first rumbles of distant thunder echoed across the plains. Ralph, annoyed by the weather and the effect it was having on the herd, drank more heavily than usual. He came to her room early, took what he wanted with a rough, grunting finality, and then fell into a drunken, snoring sleep in his own chamber down the hall. Clara lay in the darkness, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was it, now or never. The wind began to howl, rattling the window pane, and the first drops of rain spattered against the glass. The storm would cover her tracks. It was a sign. Slipping out of bed, her hands shaking, she pulled on a simple cotton dress. She had no time for shoes or a shawl. Every second was precious. The lock on her door was old. She had spent days studying it, noticing how a thin piece of metal, a hairpin she had carefully straightened, might just work. Her fingers fumbled in the dark, the metal scraping against the lock. For a heart-stopping moment, it wouldn't budge. Tears of frustration pricked her eyes. She took a deep breath, whispered a prayer to a mother she could barely remember, and tried again. A soft click echoed in the silent hallway. She was free. Barefoot, she crept down the stairs, her every sense on high alert. The house was dark and still, save for the sound of the storm raging outside and the loud, rhythmic snores coming from Barlow's room. She slipped out the back door, the cold rain a shocking slap against her skin. The wind tore at her dress, plastering it to her thin frame. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the terrifying, vast emptiness around her. For a second, she faltered, the sheer scale of the wilderness threatening to swallow her whole. Then she thought of Ralph, of his cold eyes and his cruel hands, and she ran. She ran with a desperation she had never known, her bare feet stumbling over rocks and thorns, the mud sucking at her ankles. The thunder cracked overhead like the wrath of God, each clap a hammer blow that spurred her on. She did not know where she was going. She was just running away, into the heart of the storm, into the wild, unforgiving darkness. Rain lashed down, blinding her, and the wind screamed in her ears. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached with a fire that consumed her. She ran until she could run no more. Her strength gave out suddenly, her body collapsing as if its strings had been cut. She fell to the muddy ground near what looked like the edge of a canyon trail, the world tilting and spinning around her. The cold was seeping into her bones, a deep, paralyzing chill. She was exhausted, broken, and lost. The darkness began to close in, the roar of the storm fading to a distant hum. This is how it ends, she thought, a strange sense of peace settling over her, alone in the rain. Through the haze of her fading consciousness, she heard a sound that did not belong to the storm, the steady clopping of a horse's hooves. Drawing nearer, a shadow loomed over her, a figure on horseback, a silhouette against the churning, lightning-streaked sky. The horse stopped. She felt a presence beside her, saw the dark shape of a man kneeling in the mud. She flinched, a whimper escaping her lips, expecting a rough hand, a cruel voice. Instead, a hand gently brushed the wet hair from her face. It was a touch so careful, so hesitant, it felt alien. She tried to focus on the face above her, but her vision was blurry. All she could make out was the deep concern in a pair of unseen eyes before the darkness finally claimed her. A lone cowboy, riding back from a long cattle drive, had found her. A half-drowned angel collapsed on the edge of the world. Clara woke to the smell of wood smoke and the unfamiliar comfort of a soft mattress beneath her. For a moment, she was adrift, untethered from the terror of the night before. Then memory came rushing back in a cold, brutal wave, the storm, the running, the fall. Her eyes snapped open. She was not in her locked room at the Double B. She was not lying in the mud. She was in a small, one-room cabin. The walls were rough-hewn logs, chinked with dried mud and grass. Sunlight, soft and hazy, filtered through a single, greased paper window. A fire crackled gently in a stone hearth at the far end of the room, casting a warm, flickering light on a simple wooden table and 2 chairs. The place was sparse, but it was clean. A threadbare but neatly folded blanket lay over the foot of the cot she occupied. Her dress, the one she had fled in, was gone. In its place, she wore a simple, homespun cotton shift that felt soft against her skin. It was far too large for her, but it was dry and clean. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She sat up too quickly, and the world tilted. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and a sharp pain shot through her feet. She looked down. Her feet were bandaged with clean strips of cloth. There were salves applied to the cuts, their faint, herby scent rising to meet her. Someone had tended to her. A man. The cabin door creaked open, and she flinched, pulling the coarse blanket up to her chin like a shield. The man who entered was tall and lean. His shoulders stooped slightly as if he were unused to walking through doorways. He moved with a quiet, deliberate slowness, not the aggressive stride of Ralph Barlow or his men. He was younger than Ralph, perhaps 30 years old, his face weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines of hardship that made him seem older. His hair was the color of dark earth, and his eyes, when he finally looked at her, were a startlingly clear blue, like a patch of sky after a storm. They held no malice, only a deep, weary caution. He stopped just inside the door, holding a small wooden bucket. He did not approach her. He simply stood there, giving her space, his presence a question rather than a threat. "You are awake," he said. His voice was low and rasped, as if he did not use it often. Clara could only nod, her throat tight with fear. She pressed herself back against the rough wall, making herself as small as possible. This was a man's space. She was under a man's roof, wearing his clothes, in his debt. She knew what that meant. She knew what was expected in return. He seemed to read the terror in her eyes. A flicker of something, pity, perhaps, or a deep sadness, passed over his face. He set the bucket down by the door. "My name is Wyatt Hollis. You are safe here." He gestured toward the hearth, where a small pot simmered. "There is broth. When you feel able." He did not ask her name. He did not ask how she came to be half dead on a canyon trail in the middle of a thunderstorm. He simply stated his name and the fact of her safety, as if they were the only two things that mattered in the world. He then turned and went back outside, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone with the crackling fire and the pounding of her own heart. The next few days passed in a slow, cautious rhythm. Wyatt Hollis was a man of few words and even fewer movements. He would enter the cabin to add wood to the fire or to leave a plate of food on the small table, a piece of dried jerky, a portion of beans, a hard biscuit. He would leave a bucket of fresh water for her each morning. He never approached the cot. He never tried to speak to her beyond a quiet, "Good morning." He moved around her as if she were a wounded, skittish foal he was afraid of startling. When he checked the bandages on her feet, his touch was brief and clinical, his hands surprisingly gentle for a man whose palms were calloused and scarred. Clara watched him, her wariness a constant, thrumming hum beneath her skin. She was terrified of being under another man's control, of being trapped again. But Wyatt's control was of a different kind. It was a control over himself. He held himself back, his politeness a wall he built around her, giving her the one thing she had not had in months: space. He slept on a bedroll on the hard-packed earth floor by the hearth, his back to her, a silent, unassuming guardian. Slowly, cautiously, the tight knot of fear inside her began to loosen. Strand by single strand, the broth warmed her from the inside out. The quiet of the cabin, broken only by the wind and the fire, began to feel less like the silence of a prison and more like a gentle peace. When she was finally strong enough to stand, her feet still tender but healing, she began to explore the small space that had become her sanctuary. It was a simple homestead, built by a man who expected little from the world and was prepared to work hard for it. Besides the cot and table, there was a shelf holding a few worn books, their spines cracked and faded. A well-oiled rifle rested on pegs above the door. Everything had its place. It was the home of a man who lived a solitary, ordered life. She began to open up, not with words, but with actions. She started by washing the few dishes he used, her hands moving slowly in the warm water. Wyatt returned from mending a fence to find them drying by the hearth. He stopped, looked at the clean plates, then at her. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. And that was all. The lack of fuss, the simple acceptance of her contribution, was a greater comfort than any words of praise would have been. She began to help with small chores, a silent effort to repay the kindness he had shown her. She swept the floor with a handmade broom. She mended a tear in one of his shirts, her stitches small and neat, a skill her mother had taught her long ago. Each task was a small step back toward herself, a way of reclaiming a purpose beyond mere survival. The land around the cabin was as harsh and unforgiving as the plains she had fled. The wind was a constant presence, moaning through the sparse pines that dotted the hills. At night, the high, lonesome howls of wild coyotes echoed in the darkness, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lay just beyond the cabin's thin walls. Water was not a convenience. It was a daily struggle. Every drop they used had to be hauled in buckets from a shallow, rock-fed stream a quarter-mile away. The work was hard, her muscles aching with the effort, but there was a clean, honest satisfaction in it. It was work for her own sustenance, not for the benefit of a master. One afternoon, a sudden, violent storm rolled in, much like the one she had escaped through. The sky turned a dark, bruised gray, and hail the size of pebbles hammered down on the roof. They huddled inside, listening to the fury of the elements. When the storm passed, leaving a world washed clean and smelling of wet earth, they stepped outside to find their only chicken coop. A flimsy structure Wyatt had built from scraps of wood had been smashed to pieces by the wind. Their 3 hens were gone, likely taken by a predator in the chaos. Clara looked at the wreckage, her heart sinking. It was a devastating loss, a blow to their fragile existence. She expected Wyatt to curse, to rage against the cruel hand of fate. Instead, he just stood there for a long moment, his face grim, and then he began to pick up the broken pieces of wood. "I will have to build it stronger this time," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. Clara began to help him, gathering the salvageable scraps, their shared, unspoken purpose, a small shield against the vast indifference of the land. That night, something shattered. Wyatt had been out late, reinforcing the corral. When he came inside, the chill of the evening air clung to him. He carried the scent of pine, sweat, and something else, something acrid and familiar. Cigar smoke. It was not the expensive, cloying scent of Ralph Barlow's cigars, but a cheaper, rougher tobacco. Yet, it was enough. The scent hit Clara like a physical blow. She was instantly transported back to the cold, silent bedroom at the Double B, to the suffocating presence of Ralph, his whiskey-sour breath, and the smoke that always seemed to cling to his clothes. Her breath hitched in her throat. The cabin, her sanctuary, suddenly felt small and threatening. The walls seemed to close in on her. She backed away from him, her eyes wide with a terror she could not hide. She bumped into the table, rattling the tin cups. "What is it?" Wyatt asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. He took a step toward her. "Stay back," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. She began to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that shook her entire frame. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold herself together, but she was breaking apart. Sobs tore from her throat, harsh and ragged, the sound of a pain that had been held in for too long. Wyatt stopped, his face a mask of dawning comprehension. He looked from her terrified expression to the half-smoked cigarillo in his hand. He understood. He did not ask for an explanation. He immediately tossed the smoldering stub into the fire, where it hissed and died. He held up his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace. "I am sorry," he said, his voice low and gentle. "I did not think. I am sorry." He did not try to touch her. He did not try to comfort her with empty platitudes. He simply stood there, a witness to her breakdown, his own face etched with a profound and helpless sorrow. He was watching a ghost, he realized. She was not just a woman who had run from a bad situation. She was a woman who had been deeply, cruelly traumatized. He stayed on his side of the room until her sobs quieted into exhausted, shuddering breaths. Her body slumped in one of the wooden chairs. The silence that followed was thick with everything that had not been said. The next evening, as they sat by the fire, the tension between them had shifted. It was no longer the caution of strangers, but the quiet gravity of two people who had glimpsed the depth of each other's wounds. It was Wyatt who finally broke the silence. "I had a wife once," he said, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. He spoke in that same flat, quiet tone, as if he were reciting a story he had told himself 1,000 times. "Her name was Sarah. She had hair the color of corn silk and a laugh that could make wildflowers grow." He paused, a muscle tightening in his jaw. "We had a son, Daniel. He was only 4. He had his mother's laugh." Clara listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her own grief a silent echo of his. "It was the smallpox that took Sarah," Wyatt continued, his voice barely a whisper. "It swept through here 7 years ago. There was nothing I could do. I buried her myself, up on the ridge where the sun hits first in the morning." He swallowed hard. "Daniel and I were alone after that. A year later, a raiding party came through. They were after horses. I was out checking traps. When I came back, his voice broke, and he stopped. He did not need to finish. The raw, unending pain was clear in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the way he stared into the fire as if seeing the faces of his ghosts in the flames. I have been alone since, he finished, his voice regaining its flat composure. The folks in town, they whisper, some say I'm cursed, some say I'm crazy for living out here by myself. Maybe they are right. He finally turned his head, his clear blue eyes meeting hers. A man gets used to the quiet, but it does not mean he forgets the sound of a laugh. In his story, Clara found a piece of her own. They were both haunted. They were both survivors of a world that took without asking. His confession was a gift, an offering of trust that she had no words to repay. So she simply nodded, her eyes wet with unshed tears. And for the first time, the silence between them was not empty, but full of a shared, unspoken understanding. From that day on, a fragile bond began to form between them, woven not from grand gestures, but from the simple threads of daily life. It was in the stolen glances across the small cabin, in the way he started leaving a single wildflower by her plate in the morning, a splash of color in their monochrome world. It was in the way her hand accidentally brushed against his as she passed him the coffee tin. A spark of warmth that was both startling and comforting. They began to speak more, their conversations hesitant at first, limited to the practicalities of survival, the weather, the dwindling supply of flour, a strange track Wyatt found near the stream. But slowly, they began to share pieces of themselves. She told him about her mother, about the locket she still wore hidden beneath the shift. He told her about building the cabin with his own 2 hands, about the names he had given his horses. They were like 2 people learning a new language, one of quiet observation and mutual respect. Clara began to feel something she had thought was lost to her forever, a sense of safety, in Wyatt's presence. She was not property. She was not an object to be used. She was just Clara, and in the quiet safety of his cabin, the tight, terrified shell she had built around her heart began to crack. But with that safety came a new and terrible feeling, guilt. She would watch him as he chopped wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady, reassuring heartbeat in the stillness of the afternoon. She would see the fundamental decency in him, the quiet strength and the deep well of sadness he carried. And she would be consumed by the knowledge that her presence here was a danger to him. Ralph Barlow was not a man who would let his property go. He would search for her. He would hunt her. And when he found her, he would destroy not only her, but anyone who had helped her. She had escaped one prison only to potentially drag this good, haunted man into a new one. The thought was a cold stone in the pit of her stomach, a constant, nagging fear that whispered to her in the dead of night, long after the fire had died down to glowing embers. She was safe, for now, but safety, she knew, was a fragile thing in this harsh and unforgiving land, and she feared that, by saving her, Wyatt Hollis may have just doomed himself. The flour sack was nearly empty, and the salt was a fine white dust at the bottom of its tin. Wyatt had put it off for as long as he could, but survival demanded they make the trip. The town of redemption, with its prying eyes and long memories, was a necessary evil. "We need supplies," he announced one morning, his voice flat, betraying none of the apprehension he felt. Clara's hands stilled in the basin of water where she was washing their breakfast plates. Town. The word sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. Town meant people. It meant the possibility of being seen, of being recognized. Wyatt saw the fear leap into her eyes. "You can stay here if you like," he said, his voice softer now. "I can manage." She looked around the small, safe cabin, at the walls that had become her world. The thought of being left alone was almost as frightening as the thought of going here, with him. She was safe, alone. She was just a target. She took a breath, the air shaky in her lungs, and found a sliver of resolve. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. I will go with you. It was the first decision she had made for herself in what felt like a lifetime. He simply nodded, accepting her choice without question. He gave her a worn bonnet, its brim wide enough to cast her face in deep shadow, and a faded gray shawl to cover the simple dress he had found for her, a purchase from a mail-order catalog years ago, intended for a life that had never come to pass. If anyone asks, he said, avoiding her gaze as he hitched his horse, Blue, to the small buckboard wagon. Your name is Sarah, a distant cousin. Come to help me for a spell. Sarah, the name of his late wife. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Clara merely nodded, pulling the bonnet low over her brow. The journey to redemption was tense and silent. The familiar, unforgiving landscape looked different from the seat of a wagon beside Wyatt than it had from the back of Ralph Barlow's. The sun was just as hot, the dust just as thick, but the dread in her heart was a different sort. It was not the dread of a captive, but the fear of a fugitive. As they rolled down the town's single, dusty street, Clara kept her head bowed, her eyes fixed on her hands clasped tightly in her lap, but she could feel the eyes on them. She could feel the way conversations faltered as they passed, the way curtains twitched in windows. Wyatt Hollis, the town recluse, the haunted man who kept to himself, was not alone. At the general store, a stout woman with a sour face and hair pulled into a severe bun, Mrs. Gable, watched them over the top of her spectacles. Her gaze lingered on Clara, a sharp, assessing look that missed nothing, the fineness of her features, the worn but clean quality of her dress, the way she stayed close to Wyatt's side. "Wyatt," the woman said, her voice dry as dust. "Been a while." "Martha," Wyatt acknowledged with a curt nod. He handed her his list. "Need these?" As Wyatt measured out beans and flour, Mrs. Gable turned her attention to Clara. "And who might this be?" "My cousin," Wyatt answered before Clara could speak. "Sarah. She is staying with me for a time." "Cousin?" Mrs. Gable repeated, the word dripping with disbelief. She looked Clara up and down once more, a faint, knowing smirk on her lips, before she turned to weigh the salt. The encounter was repeated in different forms all over town. Men in the saloon stopped their card games to stare as they passed. Women gathered in small, whispering groups. The worst was the preacher, Reverend Miller, a tall, gaunt man with eyes that burned with righteous fire. He saw them leaving the store and stopped dead in the street, his gaze fixing on Clara as if she were a serpent in his path. He did not speak to them, but he looked at Wyatt, then at her, and then shook his head slowly, a look of grim condemnation on his face. Later, they would hear the whispers that he had spoken from his pulpit of the sin of the flesh and the damnation that awaited those who chose to live in sin out in the wilderness, away from the eyes of God and community. By the time they were back in the wagon, the small bag of supplies between them, Clara was trembling. "They all look at me," she whispered, her voice tight. "They are just bored people with nothing better to do than talk," Wyatt said, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But he knew it was more than that. He had brought trouble into his quiet life. Or rather, trouble had collapsed on his doorstep, and he had chosen to take it in. Back on the cattle ranch, Ralph Barlow's patience had run out. His fury was not hot and explosive, but a cold, grinding thing. He had been made a fool of. The girl, the property he had paid for, was gone. The slash marks on his face from the night she had fought back had healed into thin, white scars, a constant, itching reminder of her defiance. For the first few weeks, he had sent his own men out, but the plains were vast, and the storm had wiped away any tracks. Now, he was taking a different approach. He sat in the office of the town sheriff, a man named Brody, whose loyalty was as shallow as his pockets were empty. A stack of gold coins sat on the edge of the desk between them. "She is my wife," Barlow said. his voice a low growl. "She ran off, stole a valuable piece of jewelry. I want her back." Sheriff Brody eyed the gold. "Runaway wife is a domestic matter. Ralph?" "This is not a request," Barlow said, his cold eyes locking with the sheriff's. "I want every lawman, every traveler, every drunk in every saloon looking for her. Put out the word, 'There is a reward.'" He pushed the stack of coins across the desk. "This is for your attentiveness." The sheriff's hand closed over the gold. "I will see what I can do." Barlow's next stop was at the saloon, in a quiet back room where a man sat cleaning a long-barreled pistol. The man's name was Jedediah Kane. He was a bounty hunter, known for his persistence and his complete lack of conscience. He had a reputation for always finding who he was looking for, and for never bringing them back in one piece unless the price was right. "I need you to find someone," Barlow said, tossing a rolled-up poster onto the table. It was a crude drawing of Clara, with the words, "Wanted for theft," written above it. Kane picked it up, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Pretty little thing. What is she worth to you?" $500, Barlow said. "Alive. I will deal with her myself." Kane's eyes glinted. It was more than he usually got for a common criminal. "For that price," he said, laying the pistol down, "I will find her if she is hiding in the devil's own pocket, unaware of the hunt that had just begun." Clara was slowly, painstakingly, beginning to heal. The oppressive silence of the Double B had been replaced by the natural quiet of the wilderness. And in that quiet, she began to find herself again. She discovered that the kindness her mother had spoken of was not a fantasy. It was real. It was in the way Wyatt left a cup of hot coffee for her by the fire each morning. It was in the way he never looked at her with hunger or demand. It was in the way he listened, truly listened. When she found the courage to speak of small things, the color of the sky, a bird she had seen, a memory of her mother's garden. One day, Wyatt came in from his work carrying several lengths of smooth, sanded pine wood. Without a word, he began to work in a corner of the cabin. For 2 days, the sound of a saw and a hammer was a steady rhythm in the background of their lives. When he was finished, he presented her with a small, sturdy writing desk and a matching stool. It was simple, but it was beautifully made. He also placed a small, leather-bound journal and a pot of ink on its surface. "A person needs a place to put their thoughts," he said, his voice rough with an uncharacteristic shyness. Tears sprang to Clara's eyes. It was the most thoughtful gift she had ever received. Ralph had given her dresses and jewels, things to adorn her body for his own pleasure. Wyatt had given her a place for her mind, for her soul. That night, she opened the journal. Her hand trembled as she dipped the pen in ink. She did not know what to write. Finally, she wrote a single sentence. "Today, I felt seen." Her healing extended beyond the cabin walls. Wyatt had a mare, an old roan named Willow, who had a deep, festering cut on her leg from a run-in with a barbed wire fence. The horse was skittish and in pain. Clara began to tend to the wound, cleaning it each day with a soft cloth and a poultice of herbs Wyatt showed her how to prepare. At first, the horse would shy away from her, but Clara spoke to it in a low, soothing murmur, her touch gentle and patient. Slowly, the mare began to trust her, standing still for her ministrations, leaning its great head against her shoulder. In healing the animal, Clara felt a part of herself mending as well. Beside the cabin's single window, she cleared a small patch of earth, pulling the stubborn weeds and loosening the dry soil. She planted the few seeds Wyatt had, mint and rosemary. She watered the patch every day, protecting the tender shoots from the harsh sun. It was a small, hopeful act, an assertion of life in a place that seemed defined by its absence. She was putting down roots. As the days shortened and the nights grew cooler, the space between them in the small cabin seemed to shrink. The air grew thick with a new tension, a quiet, magnetic pull that was both unnerving and exhilarating. It was in the way their eyes would meet and hold for a second too long, in the way he would watch her as she read by the firelight, his expression a mixture of tenderness and a deep, aching sorrow. One night, as a coyote howled its lonely song to the moon, Wyatt finally gave voice to the feeling that had been growing between them. They sat in their usual places by the hearth, the fire painting their faces in flickering gold and shadow. "I watch you sometimes," he said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it over the crackling flames. He did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the fire. "When you are reading or tending to that little garden of yours, and I find myself afraid to blink." He paused, swallowing hard. "I am afraid that if I blink, you will be gone, that I will wake up and this will all have been a dream." His words were a confession, a laying bare of a vulnerability so profound it made her own heart ache. He saw her not as an object to be possessed, but as a fleeting, precious light in his dark, lonely world. All the fear, all the pain, all the humiliation she had endured at the hands of Ralph Barlow seemed to fall away in that moment, replaced by a wave of emotion so powerful it stole her breath. She stood up and walked the few steps that separated them. She knelt before him, her hands finding his, their fingers lacing together. He finally looked at her, his clear blue eyes full of a raw, unguarded emotion that mirrored her own. Slowly, she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion, but of gratitude. It was hesitant, gentle, a question and an answer all in one. He did not move, did not respond at first, as if he were afraid the slightest movement would shatter the spell. Then, slowly, he brought his other hand up to cup her face, his calloused thumb stroking her cheek with an impossible tenderness. When she pulled back, tears were streaming down her face. He saw them, and his own face clouded with worry, with misunderstanding. "Did I?" "No," she whispered, a sob catching in her throat. "No, you did nothing wrong." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "It is just that no one has ever just been kind." She wept then, not from fear or from pain, but from the overwhelming, earth-shattering relief of feeling a man's touch that was not a demand, but a gift. He pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, burying her face in the rough cotton of his shirt. He held her, simply held her, stroking her hair as she cried out months of pent-up sorrow and fear. That night, they did not retreat to their separate sleeping places. He led her to the small cot, and they lay down together, still fully clothed. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling the blanket over them both. There was no pressure, no expectation. There was only the solid, comforting warmth of his body next to hers, the steady rhythm of his breathing a lullaby in the quiet darkness. For the first time since her mother had died, Clara did not feel alone. She felt safe. She felt cherished. She fell asleep not as a possession in a master's house, but as a woman held in the arms of a good and gentle man. They awoke the next morning to a world that felt new and full of fragile promise. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A tentative peace had settled between them, a new intimacy that needed no words. The sound came without warning, the jingle of a harness, the soft clopping of a horse walking. Not trotting, a sound that meant the rider was in no hurry, that he was observing. Wyatt was on his feet in an instant, his body tense, his hand reaching for the rifle above the door. He peered through a small crack in the wall. A lone rider was dismounting by the corral, a tall, wiry man with a long duster coat and a confident, predatory swagger. "Get in the root cellar," Wyatt whispered, his voice urgent, his eyes cold and hard. "Now, do not make a sound." Fear, cold and familiar, gripped Clara. She scrambled toward the trap door in the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. Wyatt lifted it, revealing a small, dark space that smelled of damp earth. She climbed down the short ladder just as a sharp knock sounded at the door. Wyatt closed the door over her head, plunging her into darkness. She could hear the muffled sounds from above, the creak of the cabin door opening, the low murmur of voices. "Quite a place you got out here." A man's voice, smooth and oily, drifted down to her. A man could get real lonely. "I like the quiet." Wyatt's voice was flat, hard as stone. "What do you want?" "Just passing through. Name's Kane. Looking for someone." "A runaway girl. Pretty thing, dark hair, blue eyes. Answers to the name of Clara." Clara pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. They knew her name. "Never seen her," Wyatt said. There was a long pause. Clara could imagine the man, Kane, looking around the small cabin, his eyes taking in the single cot, the two chairs, the small pot of herbs growing by the window. "Funny thing about that," Kane's voice was laced with a chilling amusement. "My employer, Mr. Barlow, is a very determined man. He seems to think she came this way. He is offering a handsome reward, enough to make a man forget all about the quiet." Another silence. "If I see her, I will be sure to let the sheriff know." Wyatt said. "You do that," the man said. Clara could hear the sound of his boots on the floorboards as he moved toward the door. "You have a good day now." She heard the door close. She waited, her body rigid with terror, listening for the sound of his horse riding away, after what felt like an eternity. Wyatt lifted the trap door. The light that flooded the cellar was blinding. He reached a hand down to her. His face was pale, his expression grim. "He is gone," he said, helping her out of the dark hole. She looked at him, her eyes wide with the question she was too afraid to ask. "He left a warning," Wyatt said, his voice low and heavy. He looked at her, his blue eyes full of a terrible certainty. "He knows. Clara, Ralph knows you are here." The fragile morning peace shattered the moment Wyatt closed the door behind the bounty hunter. The air in the cabin, which had moments before felt warm with a new and tender hope, was now cold and thin. Fear, a taste like rust and ice, was back in Clara's mouth. Ralph knew. The words echoed in the sudden, suffocating silence. "I have to go," she said, her voice a raw whisper. She looked at Wyatt, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "He is coming for me. I cannot let him find you. I will not be the reason you are hurt." "No," Wyatt said. The word was not a suggestion. It was a flat, immovable statement. He took the rifle from its pegs and began checking the mechanism, his movements economical and precise. "You go out there alone. You will not last a day. He will find you." "It is my fight, Wyatt, not yours." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her, his blue eyes intense, cutting through her fear. "That man who was here, that is his opening move. He is not just coming for you, Clara. He is coming for what he thinks is his. That now includes everything on this land, including me." He set the rifle down. "We are in this now. Together." The wordway was a lifeline. It was a promise. The terror did not vanish. But for the first time, it was not hers to bear alone. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "We run," he said simply. "We run north, to the mining camps in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. I have kin there, a second cousin twice removed. It is not much, but it is a place to disappear. But we cannot go with empty pockets." His jaw tightened. "I have to go back to town. To the bank. My savings are there. It is not a fortune, but it is enough to get us started." The thought of him returning to that town of whispering tongues and hostile eyes made her stomach clench. "Is it safe?" "It will be quick," he promised. "In and out before anyone is the wiser. You stay here. Keep the door barred. Use the rifle if you have to. I will be back before nightfall." He saddled his horse, Blue, his movements quick and efficient. As he mounted, he leaned down, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. His touch was a reassurance, a silent vow. Then he was gone. A lone rider disappearing into the vast, sun-drenched landscape, leaving Clara alone in a silence that was once again charged with menace. Wyatt rode hard, pushing Blue faster than he liked. Every instinct screamed at him to stay, to guard the cabin, but logic dictated their need for money. In redemption. He tied his horse outside the bank, keeping his hat low. The town felt different now. Every sideways glance a potential threat. Every quiet conversation a possible conspiracy. Inside the bank, he withdrew the entirety of his savings, a modest sum earned from years of selling pelts and breaking horses. As he was leaving, a voice called his name. "Wyatt Hollis, I almost did not recognize you." He turned. It was Jeannie Carter, a seamstress who had, for a time, made it clear she was interested in him. She was a woman whose life had been as hard as anyone's in redemption, her face prematurely lined with worry. He had always been polite, but distant, his heart a locked room she could never enter. "Jeannie," he said with a nod. "It is true what they are saying." "Then?" she asked, her eyes sharp. A complicated mix of curiosity and something that looked like hurt. "That you have taken in a woman out at your homestead?" "I have a cousin staying with me," he said, his voice curt. Jeannie's smile was thin and brittle. "A cousin, of course." She looked him over, a flicker of old affection warring with a new resentment. He looked different. The haunted, empty look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective fire. It was a look she had always hoped to see, but it was not for her. "You take care, Wyatt," she said, her voice suddenly cool. He nodded again and left, unaware of the turmoil he had stirred. Two of Ralph Barlow's men, lounging in the shade of the saloon porch, had been watching the exchange. They had been in town for days, asking quiet questions, spreading Barlow's money like seed. One of them sauntered over to Jeannie as Wyatt rode away. He tipped his hat. "That the man you were telling us about, ma'am? The recluse?" Jeannie looked at the ranch hand's cruel, smiling mouth, and then at the dust cloud kicked up by Wyatt's departing horse. A bitter, lonely ache filled her chest. He had a cousin, a pretty one, no doubt. She thought of her own empty cupboards, of the way Wyatt had looked right through her. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That is him." "And he is heading back to his cabin now?" the man pressed, his hand casually resting on a pouch of coins at his belt. She hesitated for only a second. "No," she lied, the word tasting like ash. "He told me he had to ride out west to check on some traps. Said he would not be back until well after dark." She did not look at the man as he smiled. A slow, ugly thing, and dropped a few heavy coins into her hand. She just closed her fist around them, the metal cold against her skin. Back at the cabin, Clara packed. She moved with a nervous energy, gathering their few possessions into 2 saddlebags, the remaining food, a spare blanket, Wyatt's few books. She paused, her hand closing around the small, smooth locket at her neck. She thought of her mother's words about dignity, about kindness. She had found kindness here, in this small, rough cabin. It was a home, more so than any place she had ever known, and now she had to leave it. The sound came on the wind, a low thrumming that was not the breeze. Horses, more than one. Her heart leapt into her throat. She ran to the window, peering out. It was not Wyatt. It was 3 riders, moving fast, their figures stark against the horizon, and the man in the lead, thick-set and powerful even at a distance, was Ralph Barlow. Panic seized her. She slammed the bar across the door and ran for the rifle. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy weapon. She did not know if she could use it, but she would not be taken easily. Not again. The riders thundered into the clearing, pulling up in a cloud of dust. "Clara!" Barlow's voice was a roar, a sound that stripped away all the progress she had made, plunging her back into the depths of her terror. "Open this door. There is nowhere left to run." She pressed herself against the wall, the rifle heavy in her arms, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. The heavy thud of a boot against the door made her jump. Another kick, and the wood splintered. A third, and the door burst inward, ripped from its hinges. Barlow stood there, his face a mask of cold, triumphant fury. The white scars on his cheeks stood out against his reddened skin. Behind him, two of his ranch hands fanned out, their pistols drawn. Clara raised the rifle, but her hands were shaking too violently. One of the men lunged, grabbing the barrel and wrenching it from her grasp. She was defenseless. "Did you really think you could get away from me?" Barlow said, advancing on her, his eyes burning with a possessive fire. "Did you think this little cowboy could protect you?" He looked around the cabin in disgust. "This is what you chose over me? A dirt-floored hovel?" His eyes landed on the small writing desk, the journal lying open on its surface. With a swipe of his arm, he sent it crashing to the floor. "No!" Clara cried out, a protest born of a deeper wound than he could know. He grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh like a vice. "You are mine," he snarled, his face close to hers. "And you are coming home." He dragged her out of the cabin, her feet stumbling on the rough ground. The ranch hands followed, but not before they overturned the table, smashed the crockery, and kicked over the pot of herbs by the window, grinding the green shoots into the dirt with their boots. They were not just taking her. They were erasing every trace of the life she had built here, destroying the sanctuary that had allowed her to heal. As Ralph threw her onto his horse and tied her wrists before him, she looked back at the violated cabin, a sob of utter desolation tearing from her throat. When Wyatt returned, the sun was low in the sky, painting the clouds in shades of blood and bruised purple. A storm was coming. He saw the destruction from 100 yards away, the broken door hanging askew, the trampled earth. He spurred Blue into a gallop, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. The cabin was a wreck, a testament to a violent, hateful rage. His eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail of the violation, the smashed desk, the broken plates, the scattered pages of her journal, one of them bearing a single, tear-blotted sentence. "Today, I felt seen." He knelt and picked up a small, gray bundle from the floor. Her shawl. It was still warm. A cold, lethal calm settled over him. The grief-stricken man who had hidden from the world for 7 years was gone. In his place was someone older, harder, a man forged in the violence of a land that took everything and gave nothing back. He went to a loose floorboard beneath his cot and pulled out an old, worn leather gun belt. He strapped it around his waist, the familiar weight of the Colt pistol a grim comfort. He filled his pockets with cartridges. He took the rifle. He did not need to think. He only needed to act. Outside, the tracks were easy to follow. 3 horses, one of them carrying Double. They were heading back east, back toward the Double B. He swung himself into the saddle, his face a mask of stone, and urged Blue into a steady, ground-eating lope. The first drops of rain began to fall, and a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. The storm was coming, and he was riding into its heart. Clara was locked in the same upstairs room, the place where her spirit had been broken. But she was not the same person. The terror was still there, a cold, coiling serpent in her gut. But beneath it was something new, a hard, defiant anger. She had tasted freedom. She had known kindness. She would not go back to being a possession. Her wrists were bound with a rough piece of rope, the fibers cutting into her skin. The door was locked. She was a prisoner again. Night fell, and the storm broke in its full fury, the wind howling around the house like a tormented spirit. Rain lashed against the window pane. She heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs. The key turned in the lock. Ralph Barlow entered, holding a lantern in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other. He had been drinking. His eyes were glazed with a cruel, triumphant light. It is time you remembered your place. Wife, he said, setting the lantern on the dresser. He came toward her, a sneer on his lips. It is time for a lesson in obedience you will not forget. He reached for her, as his hands closed on her shoulders. Every cell in her body screamed in protest. She saw the water pitcher and basin on the washstand next to the bed. It was her only chance. With a surge of desperate strength, she twisted away from him, stumbling toward the washstand. He lunged after her, grabbing the back of her dress. As she fell, she swept her bound hands outward, knocking the heavy ceramic pitcher to the floor. It shattered with a loud crash. Barlow laughed, a low, ugly sound. A little fight left in you? Good. I like that. He forced her onto the bed, his weight pinning her down. His breath was hot and sour with whiskey. As he fumbled with his belt, his face hovering over hers. Her bound hands searched the floor beside the bed, her fingers closing around a large, sharp shard of broken porcelain. She did not hesitate. She brought her arm up in a desperate, vicious arc, raking the sharp edge of the shard across his face. He screamed, a high, strangled sound of shock and agony, and recoiled. Clutching at his cheek, blood welled between his fingers, dark and crimson in the lantern light. The momentary distraction was all she needed. She scrambled off the bed, kicking and thrashing, and ran for the open door. At the same moment, the sound of a gunshot echoed from downstairs, followed by a shout. Wyatt had arrived. He had used the storm as cover. Circling the ranch house in the darkness, he took out the lone guard at the front porch with a single, silent blow. Inside, he found 2 more ranch hands playing cards in the main room. The shootout was a blur of chaotic violence. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by the deafening roar of a shotgun. Wyatt fired back, his Colt bucking in his hand. One of the men cried out and fell, clutching his chest. The other dove for cover. Clara heard the shots and did not stop running. She flew down the stairs just as Wyatt was reloading. He saw her, his eyes wide with relief and terror. "Clara, get out!" The second ranch hand fired from behind a heavy oak table. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Wyatt's shoulder, spinning him around. He grunted in pain but stayed on his feet, returning fire, forcing the man back into cover. "Go!" he yelled, grabbing her arm and shoving her toward the back of the house. "To the stables! Get a horse!" Chaos erupted. Ralph Barlow appeared at the top of the stairs, his face a bloody mask, roaring in rage. Shots were coming from 2 directions. Wyatt laid down covering fire, giving Clara the seconds she needed to escape out the back door and into the lashing rain. She ran blindly toward the stables, her heart pounding. She found a saddled horse and, with trembling hands, managed to untie it. Wyatt stumbled out of the house moments later, clutching his bleeding shoulder, the ranch in an uproar behind him. He half climbed, half fell onto the horse behind Clara. "Go!" he gasped, his body slumping against hers. "Ride north!" She kicked the horse into a frantic gallop, riding out into the teeth of the storm, into the vast, dark wilderness. Lightning split the sky, a brilliant, terrifying flash, and in that brief illumination, she could see the blood spreading across the back of Wyatt's shirt. He was heavy against her, his breathing shallow. They rode through the maelstrom, the thunder drowning out the sound of pursuit. She had no idea where she was going, only that she had to get away, to get him to safety. He was losing consciousness, his head lolling against her shoulder. "Wyatt!" she cried, her voice torn away by the wind. "Wyatt, stay with me!" He slipped from her grasp, his name a desperate scream on her lips as he slumped further in the saddle. She held on, her arms wrapped around him, her own strength the only thing keeping him from falling. Hours later, by some miracle, she saw it, a dark, crumbling silhouette against the stormy sky, an old, abandoned trading post, its roof half caved in, its walls offering the barest promise of shelter. She guided the exhausted horse into the relative protection of a collapsed lean-to. Wyatt was a dead weight. She somehow managed to get him off the horse and drag him inside, out of the punishing rain. The inside was dark and smelled of decay and wet earth, shaking with cold and exhaustion. Clara fumbled in Wyatt's saddlebags, her hands finding a flint and steel. With trembling fingers, she managed to spark a flame on a piece of dry kindling she found in a sheltered corner. A small, brave fire sprang to life, pushing back the oppressive darkness. In the flickering light, she saw how bad it was. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, but he had lost a lot of blood. He was pale as death, his skin clammy, his breathing ragged. He was burning with fever. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it against the wound to slow the bleeding. She found his flask of whiskey and a small sewing kit in his pack. Gritting her teeth, she poured the raw alcohol over the wound and a needle. Ignoring his pained groan, there was no one else. It was up to her. All through the long, terrifying night, as the storm slowly spent its fury outside, she worked. She stitched the torn flesh together, her hands clumsy but determined. She cleaned his skin, bathed his feverish brow, and forced a little water between his lips. And when there was nothing more she could do, she sat beside him, holding his hand in both of hers, and prayed. She prayed to a God she was not sure she still believed in, her words a desperate, whispered litany in the dark, watching the man who had saved her fight for his life. The first light of dawn crept through the broken slats of the trading post wall, painting dusty gray stripes across the dirt floor. Wyatt was alive. The fever had broken in the darkest hour of the night, his breathing evening out, his skin losing its deathly pallor. Clara had not slept. She had sat vigil, watching the rise and fall of his chest, a lifeline in the vast, silent darkness. He survived, but the wound had taken its toll. He was weak, his movements slow and pained, his voice a low rasp. For days, the abandoned post became their hospital, their fortress, their world. Clara was no longer the timid girl who had fled into the storm. She was a caregiver, fierce and tender. She foraged for edible roots and berries Wyatt pointed out to her on his first, shaky steps outside. She learned to clean and dress his wound with a steady hand, her revulsion at the sight of blood replaced by a determined focus. She hunted small game with the snares he taught her to make, providing them with the meat they needed to regain their strength. Their bond, forged in the fire of shared danger, deepened into something quieter and more profound. It was a bond of mutual sacrifice. He had taken a bullet for her freedom, and now she was nursing him back to life with a tireless devotion. The roles had reversed. He was the one who was vulnerable, and she was the one who was strong. In this new dynamic, the last of her fear of him dissolved, replaced by a love so fierce it was a physical ache in her chest. One evening, as he sat propped against the wall, watching her stir a thin stew over the fire, he reached out and took her hand. His grip was weak, but his touch was full of a gratitude that needed no words. "You saved my life, Clara," he whispered, his voice still rough. Tears welled in her eyes. It was the opening she'd been waiting for, the moment of quiet safety she needed to finally unburden her soul. She sat beside him, her hand still in his, and she began to speak. The story came out in a torrent, a flood of pent-up pain and shame. She told him everything, about her stepfather, Silas, and the cold, transactional way he had sold her to settle a gambling debt, about the sham of a wedding, the contract that had signed her life away. She spoke of the suffocating isolation on the ranch, of Ralph's coldness, of the way he treated her like a prized mare he had bought and branded. Her voice dropped to a barely audible whisper as she spoke of his nightly visits, of the way she had learned to make her mind go somewhere else, a far, empty place where he could not reach her soul. She told him about the first time she had resisted, and the cold, calculated way he had struck her, the promise of what he would do if she ever tried to run, and finally, She confessed the deepest, darkest weight on her heart, the guilt. "It is my fault you are hurt," she choked out, tears finally streaming down her face. "I brought him to you. I brought this danger to your door. You were safe. You were at peace. And I ruined it." Wyatt listened. He did not interrupt, did not flinch. He simply listened, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, his clear blue eyes never leaving her face. When she was finished, her story hanging in the quiet air between them like a ghost. He was silent for a long time. She saw that his own eyes were wet, glistening in the firelight. He gently squeezed her hand. "Look at me, Clara," he said, his voice soft but firm. When she finally met his gaze, he said the words that would begin to mend the last of her broken pieces. "None of this was your fault, not one single part of it. The sin was his, not yours." He took a breath, his gaze unwavering. "What he did to you, that was not love. It was not what a husband is meant to be. Love is not pain, Clara. It is not about owning someone. It is not about fear." He paused, his eyes searching hers, willing her to believe him. It is supposed to make you feel safe. It is supposed to be a choice. And you deserve a choice. You deserve to choose who you wake beside, who you share your days with. You deserve to be cherished, not owned." His words were a balm on the raw, festering wounds of her past. He did not see her as soiled or broken. He saw her as a survivor. He saw her as worthy of a choice. In that moment, sitting in the ruins of a forgotten building, she felt more whole than she ever had in her life. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, healing purpose. As Wyatt's strength returned, they worked to make the trading post a home. They patched the worst of the holes in the roof with scavenged planks and mud. Clara swept the floors clean and found a small, unbroken crate to serve as a table. They were building a life together from the wreckage of their pasts. Wyatt's lessons shifted from survival to empowerment. He saw the tremor that still went through her when a shadow fell unexpectedly or a sudden noise broke the silence. He knew that for her to truly heal, she needed to feel strong, not just safe. He took out his Colt pistol one afternoon. "You need to know how to use this," he said simply. At first, the weight of the gun in her hand was terrifying. It was an instrument of violence, the cause of the very wound she had just spent weeks tending. But Wyatt was patient. He showed her how to stand, how to aim, how to control her breathing. "Do not think of the noise," he told her. "Think of the target. You are in control, not the gun." Her first shot went wide, the recoil jarring her shoulder, the loud report making her flinch. But she did not drop it. She took a breath, remembered his words, and tried again. The second shot was closer. The third hit the tin can he had set on a rock 50 feet away. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips. It was the first time Wyatt had seen her truly smile, and the sight was more beautiful than any sunrise he had ever witnessed. He also taught her to ride with confidence. She was no longer a terrified passenger being dragged from one prison to another. He taught her how to guide the horse with her legs, how to feel its rhythm, how to become a part of the animal. They would ride out onto the plains, and he would watch as she urged the horse into a canter, her hair flying behind her, a look of fierce, joyful freedom on her face. She was no longer running from something. She was riding toward a future she could claim as her own. Their fragile peace was broken one afternoon by the sight of a lone rider approaching from the south. Instantly, they were on alert. Wyatt grabbed his rifle, and Clara reached for the Colt, her fear now tempered with a cold resolve. But the rider was not a threat. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, dressed in a city suit that looked out of place in the wilderness. He rode slumped in his saddle, as if he had been searching for a long time. He pulled up his horse and raised a hand in a gesture of peace. "I am looking for a Mr. Wyatt Hollis and a Mrs. Clara Barlow," he called out, his voice tired. Wyatt stepped out from behind the trading post, his rifle held loosely but ready. "Who is asking?" The young man dismounted, relief washing over his face. "My name is Samuel Page. I am a lawyer from Redemption." The word "a lawyer" sent a chill through Clara, but the man's face was open and earnest. "I was hired by some of the townsfolk," Samuel explained. "After the incident at the Barlow Ranch, a man was killed. Ralph Barlow was taken into custody. Sheriff Brody had no choice." Barlow started talking, trying to blame everything on you, Mr. Hollis. But his story did not add up. He claimed Mrs. Barlow was a thief, but the men who work for him, a few of them started talking, whispering about how he treated her, how he kept her locked up. The young lawyer took a deep breath. Based on their testimony and the discovery of a certain contract in his safe, Ralph Barlow has been formally charged. Unlawful marriage contracts, false imprisonment, and abuse. The circuit judge is coming in 2 weeks. There will be a trial. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The law, which had been an instrument of her bondage, was now offering her a path to freedom. "But that is not the whole of it," Samuel continued, his expression turning grim. "Barlow is a powerful man. He has friends. He is telling everyone who will listen that you, Mrs. Barlow, are nothing but a common whore who lured a good man into sin and then tried to rob him with your cowboy lover. He is painting you as the villain." He looked at her, his eyes full of a troubled sympathy. "The town is divided. Some people, the ones who have seen Barlow's cruelty firsthand, they believe you, but others, they are listening to him. They see a runaway wife, and they are quick to judge." The old shame, the feeling of being judged and found wanting, washed over her. Her freedom was not a simple matter. It had to be fought for, not just with a gun, but with her words, with her truth, in a courtroom full of strangers who had already decided who she was. The trial was a blur of hostile stares and suffocating heat. The small courtroom in Redemption was packed, the air thick with the scent of sweat, dust, and prejudice. Clara sat beside Wyatt, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, some filled with pity, others with open contempt. Ralph Barlow sat across the room, a clean white bandage on his cheek, his arm in a sling. He looked at her, and his eyes were full of a cold, confident hatred. He was a man who believed he could own the world, and he would never forgive her for proving him wrong. When her name was called, her legs felt weak as she walked to the witness stand. She sat, her hands trembling, and swore the oath on the Bible, her voice a reedy whisper. The prosecutor began his questions, but it was the gaze of the townspeople that unnerved her the most. They were the jury that mattered, the ones who would write the story of her life in their gossip and whispers for years to come. She began her story, her voice faltering at first. She spoke of her stepfather, of the day she was sold. She saw the sneers on the faces of some of the women in the front row. Then she looked at Wyatt. He was not looking at the judge, or at Barlow, or at the crowd. He was looking only at her. His gaze was a steady, unwavering anchor in a sea of judgment. It said, simply, "I am here. I believe you. Tell your truth." She took a breath and found her strength. She looked directly at the 12 men in the jury box, men whose faces were hard and weathered by the same sun that had beaten down on her. And she told them everything. She spoke of the locked door, of the silence, of the fear. She did not use dramatic words. She did not weep. She just delivered her truth, her voice growing stronger and clearer with every sentence. She spoke of the night she ran, of the kindness of the stranger who had saved her, and of the moment she chose to fight back, not with a gun, but with a shard of broken porcelain, to defend the last thing she had left, herself. When she was finished, a profound silence filled the courtroom. It was broken only by the sound of a woman in the back quietly weeping. The verdict came the next day. Guilty, on all charges. Ralph Barlow was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor in the territorial prison. A gasp went through the crowd. As the deputies led him away, Barlow stopped and looked at Clara one last time. His face was a mask of disbelief and pure, unadulterated venom. But for the first time, his gaze held no power over her. He was just a man. A cruel, pathetic man who was now a prisoner of his own making. Clara stood up. Wyatt took her hand, and together, they walked out of the courthouse. The brilliant, unforgiving sunlight of the New Mexico territory streamed down, and she lifted her face to it, closing her eyes. She was free, legally, publicly, finally free. She had walked through fire and had not been consumed, but as the sun warmed her skin, she knew, with a certainty that was both a sorrow and a strength, that the scars from the flames would always be a part of her. They left redemption not with the hurried fear of fugitives, but with the quiet, deliberate pace of people who knew where they were going. The town and its verdict were behind them. A chapter closed. As the buckboard wagon rumbled over the dry, cracked earth, taking them back toward the homestead, the silence between them was not empty, but full of unspoken questions about the future. Wyatt was the one who finally broke it, his eyes on the vast, empty horizon. The cabin, it can be rebuilt, he said, his voice low. The land is still there. It is hard land, but it is honest. He turned to her then, his gaze direct and clear, stripped of all artifice. It is a hard life. Clara, I cannot offer you fine things. I cannot promise you an easy road. All I have is that small piece of earth and the work of my own 2 hands. He paused, and she could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear of rejection that was as potent as any fear of a bounty hunter's gun. I am asking if you want to stay, to build a life there with me, not as a woman I saved, but as my partner, as my equal. We would face it all together, the good and the bad. His words were a proposition not of ownership, but of partnership. He was offering her a choice, the very thing he had said she deserved. She looked down at her own hands, resting in her lap. They were no longer the soft, unblemished hands of a girl kept indoors. They were calloused and capable, scratched from foraging for roots and strong from holding a rifle. They were the hands of a survivor. She thought of the life he was offering, a life of hardship, of struggle, of uncertainty, and she knew, with a certainty that resonated in her very soul, that it was the only life she wanted. She lifted her head and met his gaze, and for the first time there was no shadow of fear in her eyes, only a clear, steady light. I do not want to be saved anymore. Wyatt, she said, her voice full of a strength she had not known she possessed. I want to live. I want to feel the sun on my face and the ache in my muscles from a day of honest work. I want to plant a seed in the ground and watch it grow. I want to build something. With you. A slow smile spread across Wyatt's face, a rare and beautiful thing that seemed to erase the lines of hardship and grief, leaving only the man he was meant to be. He reached over and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a silent, binding promise. They did not need a contract or a preacher. Their pact was made there, under the wide, unforgiving sky, a partnership forged in fire and sealed with a choice. Returning to the homestead was like returning to a battlefield after the war. The broken door, the smashed furniture, the trampled garden, it was a testament to the hatred they had overcome. For a moment, a wave of despair washed over Clara, but it was fleeting. This was not a grave. It was a foundation. They began to work. The labor was grueling, a relentless battle against a land that gave up its treasures reluctantly. They repaired the cabin, Wyatt's skill with an axe, and saw matched by Clara's determination to make it a home. She chinked the walls, patched the roof, and scrubbed every surface until the scent of violence was replaced by the clean smell of pine and soap. Wyatt rebuilt her writing desk, its surface smoother than before. Life was a series of small victories and crushing defeats. They planted a new garden, a larger one this time, their hopes sown in neat rows alongside the corn and beans. But a late frost, a cruel, unseasonable cold snap, turned the tender green shoots black overnight. Clara stood before the ruined patch of earth, the sight a painful echo of past destructions. She felt the old, familiar sting of tears. But before they could fall, Wyatt came to stand beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "The earth is not always kind," he said quietly. "So we plant again." And they did. They bought a few sheep, their bleating a welcome sound in the vast silence. One night, the frantic cries of the small flock woke them. Wyatt grabbed his rifle and ran outside to find a pair of coyotes, their eyes glowing like embers in the darkness, slinking away from the corral. A newborn lamb lay dead in the dust, its mother bleating piteously beside it. They had lost a part of their future, a piece of their investment. That night, they ate their meager supper in silence, the weight of the loss heavy between them. But the next morning, Wyatt was reinforcing the corral fence, and Clara was watching the remaining sheep with a new, vigilant intensity. They did not surrender. They endured. Slowly, a new Clara emerged, forged in the crucible of this hard-won life. The soft, plain dresses were replaced by a pair of Wyatt's old trousers, the denim worn soft and patched at the knee. They were practical, allowing her to work and ride without hindrance. She no longer wore the bonnet to hide her face, but a simple scarf to tie back her hair, letting the wind and sun color her cheeks. The rifle became as familiar to her as a needle and thread. She was a natural shot, her hand steady, her eye true. She rode beside Wyatt now, not behind him, her back straight, her seat confident. She was his partner in every sense of the word. They were two halves of a whole, moving in a silent, practiced rhythm, their lives intertwined like the roots of the stubborn pines that clung to the rocky soil. The romantic tension that had been a fragile spark between them grew into a slow, steady burn. Their days were filled with the easy intimacy of shared labor, but their nights were still chaste. Wyatt never pushed, never presumed. He was giving her time, giving her space, honoring the promise he had made to her that love was a choice. One night, after a long day of hauling water from the stream, they sat before the fire, exhausted but content. The cabin was warm and safe, a small bastion of light against the vast, dark prairie. The air between them was thick with unspoken longing. Clara looked at him, at the way the firelight softened the hard lines of his face, at the kindness in his eyes, a kindness that had been her salvation. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was gone, replaced by a deep and certain love. She reached out and laid her hand on his arm. He turned to her, his breath catching in his throat. It was she who made the choice. She leaned in, and this time, her kiss was not one of gratitude, but of desire. It was a kiss of a woman who knew her own heart and was not afraid to claim it. He responded with a tenderness that made her soul weep. He kissed her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world, his calloused hands cupping her face with a reverence that felt like a prayer. He broke the kiss and looked at her, his eyes asking the question his lips would not. She answered with a soft smile and a nod. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the cot. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and gentle. He undressed her not with the rough, impatient hands of a master claiming his property, but with the careful, worshipful touch of a man unwrapping a priceless gift. And she, in turn, undressed him, her own hands exploring the strong, scarred landscape of his body, a body that had borne wounds for her sake. When they finally came together, there was no fear, no shame, no ghosts of the past. There was only the sublime, overwhelming beauty of two broken people finding wholeness in each other's arms. It was a joining not just of bodies, but of souls, a quiet, sacred act of healing, lying there in the warm darkness, wrapped in his embrace. Clara finally understood. This was love. Not pain, not possession, but a safe, quiet harbor in a turbulent world. They carved their life out of the soil, season by season. Their small ranch grew. The garden thrived. The flock of sheep expanded. They were not rich, and they would never be. But they had something more valuable than money. They had peace. They had each other. Clara's strength became a quiet beacon. Word of her testimony had spread, and while some still whispered behind her back, others saw her as a symbol of courage. Women from neighboring homesteads, women trapped in their own quiet prisons of isolation and abuse, began to find reasons to ride out to the Hollis place. They would come ostensibly to trade for herbs or to ask for help with a sick animal, but what they were truly seeking was a piece of her strength. She started a small, informal gathering every other week. She took out the books Wyatt had given her, and she began to teach the women to read, to write their own names, to find their own voices. She did not preach or lecture. She simply shared her story, and in doing so, gave them permission to acknowledge their own. She taught them that kindness was not weakness, and that dignity was something no one could take from them. The town of Redemption slowly began to change. One day, Jeannie Carter rode out to the homestead. She approached Clara with her head bowed, her face etched with a deep and genuine shame. "I am sorry," she said, the words barely a whisper. "I was bitter and I was jealous. What I did was wrong. I do not expect you to forgive me, but I had to say it." Clara looked at the woman, at the hard life etched on her face, and saw not a villain, but another victim of a harsh world. "I forgive you," she said, and in that act of grace, she freed herself as much as she freed Jeannie. Others followed. Some apologized outright. Others would simply give Wyatt and Clara a nod of respect when they saw them in town. The Gables and the Millers of the world would never change their minds, their lips forever pursed in judgment. But Wyatt and Clara had stopped living for them. Their world was the stretch of land under their feet, the sky above their heads, and the quiet, unshakable love that filled the space between them. On the evening of their first anniversary, the day Wyatt had asked her to be his partner, Clara sat at the small writing desk he had built for her twice. The sun was setting, casting long, golden fingers of light across the prairie. The wind whispered through the tall grass, a sound that was no longer lonely, but full of peace. She opened the leather-bound journal, its pages now filled with her neat, confident script. She dipped her pen in the ink, and in the fading light, she wrote a final entry to close the chapter of her past. "I was once sold like cattle, but now I choose who I wake beside." She closed the book and walked outside. Wyatt was standing by the corral, looking out at the horizon, at the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. She came to stand beside him, not behind him, their shoulders touching. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. She leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of earth, leather, and the good, honest man who was her home. The sun dipped below the edge of the world, and the first stars began to prick the velvet darkness. She stood tall, her hand in his, no longer a fragile bride sold in desperation, but a woman reborn by love, by fire, and by the unwavering strength of her own courage. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. Let us know where you are tuning in from in the comments so we can all connect. Be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.